All right, welcome to episode 60 of Researching Happy. We're going to go on a slightly different tack today. We've got Dr. Shane Huntington, OAM, who's the CEO of the Australian Society of Mental Health of Medical Research. So I'm so used to saying mental health research, of medical research. Here to talk about the latest results in terms of funding applications in Australia. So this episode has got a draft title, which is Researching Unhappy, because we know that there's this big gap, I think, across the sector, but particularly, or maybe selfishly, at the early career stage. So welcome, Shane.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast. It's great to be here.
No problem. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you've landed in the CEO role, and what ASMR gets up to.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a mixed history, Matt. So I started off as a physicist, actually. So I started in astrophysics, ended up in sort of quantum encryption technologies and imaging. Did that for about 12 years. I had my own center at one point and then decided research was no longer for me. So I moved into a strategy role, running strategy for the University of Melbourne, which was really super interesting, running strategy for essentially a $2 billion business with a lot of components. That was great. Then headed off into the similar role with the medical faculty at Melbourne Uni. Did a similar job there for quite a while, then eventually left in what I call the Great Purge of 2021, when universities were downscaling, and ended up with a redundancy there, which actually was great for me because after 27 years, I was probably never going to leave the place. But, with a bit of encouragement and money, I left. And started running a kids' cancer charity actually for 4 years, which was really interesting, very different world for me. Did that fairly successfully. And then saw the Australian Society for Medical Research was looking for an inaugural CEO after 64 years, actually. So they'd never had a CEO before.
Really? I didn't know.
And alongside of all this, I'd been running my own business and doing a radio show in Melbourne for 31 odd years now, and just thought, well, I've been working with early career researchers and PhD students, supporting them in a sort of volunteer capacity for like 3 decades. I could get paid to do the same thing. This sounds great. Applied for the job, thankfully got it, and have been doing that since April this year, and it's great. I love it. So
yeah, awesome. That is pretty diverse. And just out of interest, I mentioned to you off air that I spend most of my time in the week at a sort of a wellbeing translation social enterprise, but we're actually owned by Camp Quality. So there's a bit of an overlap there on kids' cancer charities.
Yep.
And so what is it, just for a bit of background on ASMR, what does it do?
So the Australian Society for Medical Research is really a peak body, if you will, that's there to represent the individuals, so the researchers themselves. So there's many peak bodies that represent institutions, as you probably know, but ASMR represents the individuals. So our job is to provide them with opportunities to do things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, like conferences where it's kind of safe and supportive for early career researchers and not so hostile. We talk to government on behalf of researchers, obviously, with regards to a range of things. We provide professional development for early career researchers and researchers across the board, really. But we're there to, make sure, try and make sure at least that the ecosystem is a positive one, and that things are heading in the right direction, and also, communicating with the community actually about what's important in research and why we think it should be supported. It's sort of a broad range of things that we do, but we do have a real bent towards early career researchers, where I think the need is greatest.
Yeah, and I guess we've heard, I don't know if this is I've just heard this term of like the valley of death, basically. I don't know if that's considered a technical term or like a well-established term, but this idea that you're actually quite vulnerable in those early career post-PhD years.
Yeah. Yeah. The valley of death term usually actually comes from the sort of commercialization of research arm, where, there's a period where the funding kind of just drops off really rapidly and you get caught. But I think it's equally reasonably applied, I think, to, when you kind of enter that sort of probably level B stage of your career, where you're transitioning from being a researcher who's very dependent on other researchers to someone who essentially becomes the one that others are dependent on. And there's there's very little training, there's very little support for that transition. And all of a sudden you might be in charge of 3 or 4 people, or, as I found, one of the things most startling is that you're suddenly in or responsible for quite a few people's well-being and their finances, in some cases, and paying off their homes. that's a different modality to just being a researcher in a lab as an early postdoc. That's a really big change in responsibility.
Yeah. And to be fair, something that, if I understand correctly, doesn't actually come with much training. Like you've got such nuanced expertise, and now you're managing budgets and
Yeah. Yeah, I will
dealing with
tell
the
you
university.
the majority of the skills I had, Matt, when I started doing that, I'd learnt when I was a late teenager, early 20s, working in a video library in the west of Melbourne. And I had a lot of staff, and I coordinated budgets and buying and all sorts of things there. So all the skills that I needed to run a big research lab, I actually learnt in the retail sector before I even went to uni. So there was no training for that when I was at university at all. It was sink or swim. So I was lucky. I had some background.
I don't know why when you were saying earlier, I was thinking, please tell me it was Blockbuster. I don't know why.
No, it was Movieland. We were trying to keep Blockbuster, the American company, out of Australia. We did well for a very long time, but then Blockbuster did come in and beat us up. That's
Awesome.
fair.
Oh, well, I apologize for that. All right, very cool. So, this conversation, I guess, has come about because funding results have just been released. And so I'm really keen just to hear, firstly, if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of a landscape. I've got a few questions here. I'll read through them, but basically, I think mine are a little bit specific to one scheme. So I'm happy to hear from you a little bit more broadly. What's happened, basically, and what does this mean for research in Australia?
Yeah, look, I think if we we can talk about the Australian Research Council, and we can talk about the NHMRC and the MRFF, but there's a similar problem across the board. I mean, and it's multifaceted, and it's not easy to get our heads around in a quick sort of period of time. But it's fair to say that there are more researchers than ever in the system, and there isn't a proportional amount of money to support them all. What I see happening, which is pretty stark, is, and you and I have sort of discussed this briefly, but the success rates of grant applications has nosedived since when I was a researcher. And it's interesting, I was talking to my wife about this just the other day, and I said, when I was a researcher, grants were hard to get, and most of the grants, the success rate was around 25%. And I often speak about a cultural shift that has occurred in research because of the change in success rates. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I was a researcher in my early postdoc days, I knew that for me to get a grant, I had to beat 3 other people. And, I thought I was pretty good at my work. I was pretty good at communicating it. I thought I had a pretty good crack at doing that. And I felt reasonably confident going in. I knew it was still a bit of a gamble, but I knew if I worked hard, I had a pretty good crack at doing that. And I was a physicist, bit of arrogance there probably, but, anyway, it was a reasonable thing for me to think that. The recent, one of the NH and MRC grants that's just come out, the Ideas grants, the success rate of that program, and that's similar to the grants I sort of went for when I was early in my career, just came out at 8.1%. Now, that means that for every grant you get, you had to beat 11 people. Now, that's not confidence or arrogance if you think you're going to do that. That's delusion. So the very basic elements of how we think about going after grants has changed quite substantially. And I think, the grant, I know that in your world, it's the DECRA grants, those early researcher grants from the ARC. And I think they're sitting at just over 10%. But again, you have to beat 8 or 9 people to get your grant. Now, you can think that you're that great, but in reality, that's not how the system works. In fact, it's not even about quality at this point, because probably I would estimate 40, maybe if you push me, 50% of the applications that go in are fundable. But let's be really mean and say it's 30%. Only 1 in 3 should be funded.
You mean of the quality that would deserve funding?
Decent applications that deserve funding, good science. And the reality is, if I say 1 in 3 should be funded, only 1 in 3 of those is being funded. Now, at that point, you've got another 2 out of 3 there that should be funded. They're decent research. We'll benefit from them as a country, but they have no chance. Now, I don't even know why we bother doing a review of that last bit, right? Because if that sort of group of 3 are all fundable, well, why don't you just draw one out of a hat? Don't bother wasting people's time with a second sort of level application and more review and so forth. We're just wasting time because we don't know how to communicate to ourselves. So I've talked to many researchers about this, and most of them would trust a lottery more than they would trust a review process. And in fact, there's many elements of the review process that are so biased towards particular genders and individuals, that a lot of it would actually be fairer. Like, it's not just a sort of offhanded remark. It would actually be a fairer system, especially at that top end where the last third, you're sort of working out, well, we've got, there's 3 out of the 10 people that applied, and we're trying to work out which of those 3 we have to pick one. Let's get them to write another 50-page application so we can work that out. It's like, no, just pick it out of a hat. It doesn't matter at this point. They're all deserving, And so we've got to this point where the success rates are so low now that it's really shifting the culture, and it's changing the way people think about their careers. It's changing how much time they're having to spend on applications, because, you have people applying for not just 1 grant a year, but 4 or 5 different grants a year. They're spending 40 to 50% of the year just writing applications to do the work rather than actually doing the work. This cultural shift is really, just perpetrating through the entire system. And I have to say, when people my age, sort of look back and we say, back in our day, we didn't complain so much about grants. It's like, yeah, but back in my day, there was a reasonable chance you would get funded. And if you were good at your work, you might have to apply 2 years in a row, but you pretty much get across the line. Most of us did. Whereas, today, when you're talking about a 1 in 10 chance, and it's not just to do the projects, in many cases, that's for salary. So, you spend, what most people are probably in their mid-20s by the time they've finished their PhD. You've just spent your entire life training for this particular type of job. And someone says to you, well, your chance of continuing, Matt, is 1 in 10. How do you feel? And that is devastating. And I think we have a really big problem on our hands if we're going to continue treating our researchers with that level of disrespect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I could just imagine the headline like, you guys like randomization so much, we're doing a lottery.
Yeah.
So it's, I guess, so there's bias in the system. There's significant effort that goes into the grant application. You go in knowing that you've basically got no chance. One extra thing I'd like to throw into the mix is that this is probably not fair language, but there's a kind of a cartel of big institutions and there are lesser institutions, and that makes a difference too. So if you happen to be an ECR who, for whatever reason, aren't supported by a massive faculty of successful prior winners, I'd like to just throw that into the mix. So there's kind of no independence. It just happens to be, it's like almost a bit, I don't know, paternalistic. I don't know what the word would be there, but, does that play a role too, do you think?
Yeah, look, there is an issue there, but I'll tell you there is a rebalancing there that I've seen recently, which is surprising. So in the past, obviously the big universities, the group of 8 universities, there was always a big advantage. They would get the majority of the money. But one thing that's happened more recently, which I think is very interesting, is there's been a bit of a shift away from that. And some of the, what we'd probably term, second tier universities, they're still great universities, many of them, are doing a lot better than they used to. And the reason for that is that when you get to such low success rates, what matters the most is not so much the research, but how well it's communicated. And with some of the older universities, there's an arrogance around that where it seems as though it doesn't matter. And I've seen this in particular with the Centre of Excellence bids. And that's big money from the ARC. So these are big programs that run for 7 years. They get about 35 million from the ARC. And about matching money from other partners. So they're usually, in excess of $70 million. They're huge. The ones that you would think, the universities, some of the big group of 8 universities where you think they would absolutely control that game, have not. They have not. In fact, I train a lot of those groups for their interviews, and many of the groups I've trained are not from the group of 8. They are from the smaller universities who are focused very strongly on the importance of clear communication in their applications. And so there's a bit of a shift there because some of these universities that are in the past, like, how do we compete? How do we compete? With these big labs, these big, well, now actually they can compete by communicating better. And when you get down into that last 10%, where you're saying, okay, I've got to pick 1 in 10. It's not about the research at that point. The research is great from all of them. But this one that Matt wrote is communicated so much more clearly for our diverse panel of reviewers. We're going to go with that. Yeah. And so there's a bit of a shift there. It's not complete, but it's, it is happening. And I think people are starting to realize what got me across the line, 30 years ago was that I put more effort into the communication of my grants than the research. And that was what got me or the grants that I applied for. I didn't have the research background at that point, so I had to have another advantage. And fortunately for me, I'd been doing radio for a few years and working on how to communicate. And so I had an advantage over some of my colleagues. And I think we're seeing a bit of this at the moment where some of the younger universities or smaller universities, the ones further down the ranking, if you like, they are spending money on getting people's communication standards up, and that is paying off for them. And I actually think that's fabulous because for me, I put a lot of weight behind the value of communication and research.
Absolutely. I mean, I have been involved in a couple of applications, some successful, some not successful, more obviously unsuccessful than successful. But it blew me away, I guess, like these unwritten rules about how you structure, this standard 5-page document. Like, oh no, you have to do this. You put that in a box. Make sure that's bold. This font, this spacing, like, and there's this gamesmanship world that just from the outside you would have no idea. It's just this knowledge held by research officers or something around the country.
Yeah. Well, actually, and the funny thing is, believe it or not, it's often not held by the research teams. They're really good with compliance, but communication is not often their core area of expertise. But when I'm not running the Australian Society for Medical Research, I do a lot of, I only do that 0.8. So the other 0.2 of my week is spent as a consultant. And the one thing I do more than anything else is run workshops on grant writing. And so what I try and do is teach as many people as possible those tricks so that the, how they structure the wording and the way that the information comes across, they're not failing because of that. It really guts me when I see a researcher with a fantastic research idea, not getting funded because they can't write a good first paragraph to their grant. Like that should never be the reason, but it actually is the most common reason for people not being funded. So I do a very large number of workshops on grant writing because it's something that universities don't teach, or they're often not capable of teaching it, but they don't offer it typically.
Yeah, like I'm obviously no expert of this, but like what I've learned through like apprenticeship or something, you know what I mean? This just like, or mentorship, I guess, probably. And who knows whether, any of that's accurate or not. The other thing I'll throw into the mix is the reviewers themselves probably being burnt out and busy. And so I can imagine when you say, the first paragraph of this highly technical document has to basically be so simple that a reviewer at 10 p.m. who's just looked at 15 of these things can kind of make heads or tails of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it matters a huge amount. In fact, one of the things we don't do, we demonize reviewers a lot, obviously, because we don't like the outcomes often from the review process. Part of the sort of trick to getting grants across the line is to think about how a reviewer themselves thinks and feels. And if you give me a document where I'm reading it and I have to reread paragraphs because it didn't kind of sit with me well, or it wasn't really easy to understand, it takes me longer to review that. Right? That's time theft. It may be a surprise to many people, but I don't want to review your grant, Matt. I'd rather be doing my work that I'm passionate about, but instead I have to take time out of my work to review your grant, and then you write something poorly. It takes me longer to read it. That pisses me off. So your expectation of getting a good score there should be pretty low at that point. So I think what I try and teach people to do is think very much about how the reviewer's cognition and engagement actually works. And it's the same as ours does. Like you start reading a book and it's boring, you don't want to read on. It's hard work, and you can make that determination in the first paragraph or two. So, we have these people submitting these 100-page applications, not realizing that in the sometimes first sentence or two, the reviewer has already changed their perspective as to how they're reading it because you've annoyed them. And, I often say to people, you should spend the same amount of time on the first paragraph as you spend on the next 10 pages.
Really?
Because, and we know this because of our own experiences. Like if I said to you, when you watch a movie, how long does it take you to work out whether you're going to like it? Now, your answer is probably going to be somewhere between 1 and 3 minutes, right? And that film's 100 minutes long. So you're completely determining the outcome after 1 to 3%. Now, why would you react any differently when you read a grant? Your brain is going through the same process. You're doing the same evaluation. You're doing the same comparison to other things you've seen in your life. But when you hear that and you think, holy crap, is that how quickly people make assessments? Well, sadly, yes. And the same thing happens with your podcast. The same thing happens when someone gets up at a conference and gives a talk. We make our mind up in the first 30 seconds. And we have to be mindful of that when we're submitting a grant and be caring towards our reviewer to say, okay, I'm going to help you, be good to me. And if we don't think of it that way, we're in trouble. And
Yeah.
if you're competing, as I say, if you're, there's 12 people in the room and only one person gets funded, you need to be the kindest, most well thought out, well communicated person by quite a margin in that room.
Mm-hmm.
And weirdly, this is a part I love. It's actually not that hard to be the standout when it comes to communication in research, because researchers aren't trained to do it. So if you apply some effort to really fine tuning your research, communication skills, you can put yourself into much better statistics than 1 in 12.
So what I'm hearing is I shouldn't publish this episode. I should keep these pointers to myself so I can outcompete the market. Is that what you're telling me, Shane?
Well, it's probably not a bad idea. But look, I think it's one of those things where, ideally, I want a scenario where there's a lot more funding in the system. I think, to be fair to the reviewers and the ARC and the NH and MRC, they only have a certain amount of money to give out. And there are more and more researchers, especially in the health and medical research space. There's a lot of researchers. And so, what do? They're getting pushed in multiple directions. Oh, $1 million isn't enough for this project. I want $2 million. Well, okay, that's fine, but that means half the number of people get funded. So they've got to make these choices, and they try to do it in a way that I think is sense. I mean, these aren't stupid people. They're not making choices, that are ridiculous, but they're making choices with, I think, is probably, the least amount of negative impact, and that's still bad.
Yeah. So in terms of like what we can agree on, say, we'll jump into sort of reforms that maybe yourself or ASMR are asking for, but can we agree that grant writing should be competitive to some degree? We can agree on that?
Look, the one thing I would say first up is the current methodology for assessing people is appalling. Like, I don't need 100 pages. I don't need 50 pages to assess you. I need 2. And as a writer, you could get away with writing 2 pages and I can assess you with 98% of the proficiency I could do it if I had 50. So that would reduce your time, my time, everyone's happier. We need to move towards these shorter, well-communicated applications. So, that I think is something we need to do by default.
And is that when you say, I guess just for background, if people aren't familiar, part of grants and the weighting kind of changes between schemes, but part of the grant is about who you are and what you've achieved. Part of it is about the quality of what you're proposing to do. Sometimes it involves the team that you've put together. And you're saying basically at the moment that can be anywhere from 10 to 100 pages and it could actually be done in fewer.
Yeah, absolutely. And the duplication is a problem too. I mean, every time you put in a grant, you do all the stuff about yourself and your career. We should just have that on the system that's auto-uploaded. I mean, the reality is I actually don't care that much about what you've done. I care about whether or not you have the capabilities to do what you're proposing. That's not always the same thing. And in fact, if you're proposing something which I would like to see more of, that's more innovative and less incremental, because we have a system at the moment where you almost have to prove you've already done the work before you can get the grant to do the work. It's so incremental that I want you to be able to propose things that are a bit out there, a bit unusual, but you have the capabilities to explore them. I mean, that's what fundamental research is really about. Not all funding should go to that, but a big slice of it should go to that. So that in 30 years, we look back and go, gee, I'm really glad those guys did the CRISPR work early on because it's paying off for us now.
Yeah. And that's quite the irony, isn't it? That because the funding environment is so tight that people are really not going to very exploratory places with their research. Whether they spend the money on that or not, maybe is a different story, but at least what they're proposing is something, like you say, that's basically foolproof. Sorry, not foolproof. Like it's basically very likely to achieve the objectives that it sets out to do, which ultimately doesn't progress us very far.
Not at all. It's low risk, but it's also low return. And I think you got to remember my background's physics. So when I look at some of our stuff, the return rate can take 50 to 100 years. Many research areas are not that long. Like we talk about health and medical research in the 10 to sort of 30-year range, and we talk about it like it's forever. But I think like you're walking around with a mobile phone that has a GPS system in it. That GPS system has corrections in it for both general and special relativity that came from Einstein 100 years ago. I mean, this is amazing stuff. But I can tell you that when Einstein was doing that work, he wasn't thinking about your GPS phone. um, like you've got to be able to explore weird and wonderful things, and that's how science, really evolves. But if you already know the answer to everything you're doing and it's incremental, that might feel good in the short space of a couple of years, but it won't feel good in decades.
Probably already in those decades, I would imagine. So in terms of, so we're sort of agreed that, like, yes, it should be competitive to some degree. Not all proposed projects are good. I'm wondering about, we can all ask for more money, and anyone advocating for anything is asking for more money. Is there an issue with, like, how many researchers there are in the field? Like you say, have we just pumped too many people through the education pyramid sort of thing? And I don't say that in any callous way. Like, education is liberation in many ways, and
Yep.
I'm part of that. But are there too many researchers in the system?
There's some components of that I think are distorted, which are problematic. So, for example, there are a lot of PhD students in the system at the moment, but let's have a think about why they're there. Because of the reduction in funding, or the poor funding levels for research across the board, I don't have money anymore to hire postdocs. So what I'll do instead is I'll get more PhD students into my program. PhD students don't cost me anything. In fact, the university makes money off them when they complete their, it's like over $80,000 a university will get for a PhD student, I think, when
Almost more than the PhD
complete.
student.
Yeah. And so not only do I get them to work for me for free, but the uni actually makes money off them. So I've compensated for not having enough money for postdoctoral staff, which are far more effective at doing the research, mind you, to be fair. But now I've got all these PhD students in the mix. Sooner or later, they're going to finish and they're going to want to go somewhere. And now we're back to the problem of not having enough postdoc positions. That's why I got all the PhD students in the first instance. You can sort of see where this cycle is going. So there are some issues with numbers, no doubt, but there are some other issues that we can solve immediately. So the Medical Research Future Fund is a good example of this. The government was trying to, this is multiple governments over years now have built this up. The idea was to generate a $20 billion base, and the income of that base would be distributed to health and medical research every year. The income was estimated to be $1 billion. Now, a few years back, and this makes good sense, when the amount was being built up, we weren't quite at the 20 billion. I think it was the Morrison government at the time decided, well, we're going to hold the amount we hand out at about 650 million because we're not sure about the returns on this thing, and we don't want to deplete the base. Now, unfortunately, that 650 has kind of just stayed as an artificial amount that's handed out each year. That base now is sitting at 24 billion. And in fact, one of the MPs, Monique Ryan, recently had the parliamentary finance group do some numbers on this and determined that we could hand out 1.4 billion a year at the moment without depleting the base ongoing. Now, that's extraordinary, but hang on a minute, we're only handing out 650 million. So in a sense, what I'm saying there is I don't want extra money. I just want the money that's already been allocated to research used for research. Now, when you come out of the NH and MRC round that's just occurred with an 8.1% success rate, and you also know that there's, do the numbers there, almost $800 million being unspent, that's just propping up the budget bottom line for the federal government, you would be reasonably, okay to say, I'm a bit pissed off about the fact that the money that was meant to be for research, that the public knew about being for research, that we promised researchers would be there, is just sitting in a bank account, making our accounts look better. And I don't have a job next year because I didn't get my grant. So I think what we need to move towards is a system where we say, okay, here is an allocation we deemed necessary and appropriate, 6-7 years ago, whenever we started the MRFF. Well, let's just use that. Now that deals with one side of the fence, if you like. Now the Australian Research Council side, the non-health and medical research side, is different again. I mean, you look at the total funding for the ARC, it's not that great. I mean, it's small relative to other expenditures in the budget, but the outcomes and the potential, wins from that are quite extraordinary. So I think part of it is more money, but part of it is also acknowledging that the money's already there and ready to go. And in some instances, we can do that. But there's another piece of the puzzle that I think is really important for us to really have a crack at. And that is, I hear people all the time say, I didn't make it, or I had to leave, or, I it wasn't competitive. I didn't get my grants. And I think, hang on a minute, just because you leave academia and the core sort of that narrow career pathway, we have taught everyone, universities do a great job of this, teach everyone that you're a failure if you don't stick in that pathway. That is absolute nonsense. And we need to stop thinking that way. I know so many people who've left the sector and have taken this incredible skills and applied them outside of that core research sector into other industries, and they are as happy as can be. They're usually glad they did. They've gone into another area. They're doing great. They feel valued and respected. So, being in a university or in a medical research or other institute is not the only location where you can feel valued and respected and make great use of your education. Unfortunately, we've taught everyone that that's the case. And I think we need to move away from that. We need to celebrate more diverse career pathways, and we need to prepare people for them as well, because not all of what you learn in a PhD prepares you for anything but the core area that you're doing the PhD in. But I had a conversation with someone just yesterday where I said to them, I said, don't forget, you are in the top 1% of intellectual capability amongst our population in terms of education, the whole lot. If you're worried about getting a job, there's something wrong, because you will always find places where you can apply your knowledge and skills when you are that well educated. So I think we need to move away from this mindset of failure all the time, because it's just not realistic. And I think of all the skills that I learned in my undergrad and my physics and so forth, and I use them all the time. Problem solving skills, I use them all the time, and I'm not in that field anymore. So that's part of it as well. So part of it's more money for grants, I think, for the ARC. Part of it is utilizing the money that's already there for health and medical research. And then the third part is just redefining what we think of as success for our researchers.
Very well said. Very well said. Yeah, no. Well, thank you, basically. I think, I guess my last question is what is the reception for that type of messaging? Like I'm thinking like this is probably not a useful way to hold negotiations, but the stick now, the threat of, psychosocial risks in the workplace, that legislation rolling across the country, it might be one of the worst industries. That idea that people have incredible job uncertainty. They're basically told to dance for their job, something like that. But yeah, how, where's the pushback come from? Because nothing seems to change.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I think there are some things that are happening at the moment. I think as we've dropped below 10% success rates in some of these grant schemes, I think we've reached, we've probably exceeded it, but there was a threshold there for me psychologically that just says, okay, enough's enough. And, you may not remember this, Matt, but it was over 10 years ago now, but there was a time when Julia Gillard was in office, and there was a threat against the NHMRC program of a cut of $400 million. And at that time, we ran a campaign against that cut called Discoveries Need Dollars. And I remember being down at the City Square, and you would have probably seen this in Adelaide as well, but I was at the City Square in Melbourne with several thousand researchers and members of the community protesting against that cut. And that cut was removed. It didn't happen as a result of that public. Now, to be fair, I think at the time we were all asking for more money from the NHMRC, and the government, instead of giving us more money, threatened to cut. And then when the cut was removed, we all thanked them for not cutting, but we didn't get any money. So it was a masterful piece of strategy, in my view, from the government. But I think we're at the threshold again now where this is going to happen again.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people at the moment talking to me about setting something up similar. We'd probably call it Discoveries Still Need Dollars, because we're back exactly where we were, in the same situation. But I don't think it is reasonable to bring people into a career where their career continuity is sitting at below 10%. I think that is not reasonable, and the damage to people's mental health, physical health, the whole lot is becoming quite substantial. And I come across so many researchers who are really, at the end of their tether, and it's affecting their, their family life, their enjoyment of their job, stuff they should be loving, that we do need to do something. So I know in my position running the Australian Society for Medical Research, and also just my role on radio and so forth, I mean, this is not something I'm going to go quietly into the night on over the next 6 months. We'll be taking sort of various actions to make sure that changes are put in place. Now, what can we promise? I don't know. Governments ignore good causes all the time. But if no one knows we're suffering, and I think that's a big part of it for researchers, it's kept inside the tent. The average person on the street does not know just how bad. If you walked up to someone in a shopping center and said, "Hey, how would you feel about an 8% chance of having your job next year?" They would rightfully tell you, to go away. But that's the reality for a lot of our researchers, and that's just not okay.
Mhm.
And we have a responsibility, and our responsibility is either to tell them, you know what, there's no room at the inn. You need to go and do another job, but you need to do another course because we have too many of these people at the moment in our system. I don't want to see that. I don't want a scenario where we're telling people, don't learn to be critical thinkers, don't learn to be problem solvers. I mean, that would just be a shocking thing for our society to do. Something's got to give, because
Mhm.
at the moment we are damaging people in a very real sense, and that's not something that we should just let go.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. And thank you for your time. Probably one last question, I guess. Maybe this is too obvious and you've already been around the block on this stuff. First question is, how do people get involved if they want to join this, this next 6 months, this march on Canberra? Just joking. But I'm just reminded of I was at SAMRI for like 10 years. I'm actually
Yeah.
still affiliated there. There's someone at SAMRI, Professor Tim Hughes, who basically discovered a cancer and has cured it in his lifetime, right? And there are many, many, many such cases. No one knows who he is. He's proudly Adelaidean, I'm pretty sure, has done all this work from here on the back of this type of funding. Is it about celebrating these cases? Because I do think that there's the perception of, like, the ivory tower, you're just looking for more handouts. What are you even doing that kind of idea? But these are heroic achievements, and they're anonymous somehow.
Yeah, you're not wrong, Matt. I think you can go and have conversations with almost anyone in Australia about their sporting heroes, their other television movie heroes, their music heroes. And we know lots of them. If I go down the street and ask people to name 3 scientists in Australia who've done great things, you'll get nothing. And I think part of it is the way we go about that communication. Like we don't typically use the sort of mechanisms that people are interested in, or bring them into our world. We often separate ourselves from them in a way that's problematic. And I think, I see there's potential to get some of our science ideas into the community in ways that we didn't expect. I tell you, back in, I think it was like 2001, I was in Japan, in Tokyo, and I was asked to represent Australia at a nanotechnology conference on this panel. And the panel was about how we communicate the value of nanotechnology, to the community. And I made a suggestion that, a couple of people almost laughed at. And I said, put in computer games. The kids, back then, who are adults now, mind you, will learn all of the terminology and some of the science around this. And people are like, no, there's no point in that, And I thought, really? I thought my kids have got enormous amounts of knowledge from the computer games they
Yeah.
play. And if we just infest it in there so they don't know they're getting it, they'll be more aware. Like, there's things like that where I think everyone knows about films like Interstellar, or, some of these sort of films where the science is actually pretty decent. But we've got to reach people where they normally are. Like universities often say, oh, we've got a public lecture, come onto campus. And I mean, who's doing that? You go there, I reckon you check everyone at the door and see who they are. And most of those people are already on the campus. I think there's a really good example in Melbourne. The School of Physics that I was part of has something called the July Lectures in Physics. These are, they're kind of almost got cult status now, where they've had to change the venue about 3 times because so many people come along. But, I get the speakers for that event on my radio show the month before to give a little highlight of what's coming. And the presentations they give are specifically designed for the non-expert. And they bring people in, and there's similar ones overseas at some of the main universities at Harvard and Cambridge. and they bring people in a way that's meaningful to the people coming in the room. So it's not us talking to ourselves, which is what happens a lot. It's us talking to people in the way that's meaningful. I think we need to do a lot more about that, because I'll tell you, one of the biggest problems we have right now with regards to funding and research is, do you know how many times research funding, health and medical research, was mentioned at the last election in Australia?
I'm going to guess zero.
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 That's a concern, right? Because why? Because they didn't perceive it was an issue the public cared about. Now, I think that's a bit false in itself, but they didn't care about that as much as they did housing pricing, other things. So we've got to get back on the agenda. And when we talk about, you mentioned the example of cancers, cancer for many people now is becoming a manageable disease. This is an incredible outcome of research. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about things like that. So that's got to be back on the agenda. Us really making sure that the community is aware of some of the wins, but in a way that's meaningful to them. I would say to researchers, if you want to really learn how to communicate well, go and give talks at schools. Because kids are ruthless, right? They're ruthless. They'll tell you what they think. But that's the point where we need to reach people. If we're only worried about the people who are giving us money, we're missing the game. So
Yeah.
I think we need to do a lot more.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Shane Huntington, thank you so much for your time. This has been a bit of a detour on this podcast, but so valuable. So thank you very much. And sorry, and how can people follow along for the advocacy efforts going forwards?
Yeah, look, there's two ways. I mean, one is the Australian Society for Medical Research, obviously, is a peak body that is supported off memberships. So, this is one of the things where I say, be a member to support the actions of the peak body. Don't be a member just to see what you get as a member. It's one of those, it's essentially a contribution to us trying to get a better society going. So that's part of it. But two, if you see in the future, this may or may not happen, if you see that there's going to be some kind of rally or something to support research in your capital city, wherever that might be, go along. Support those researchers who are working ridiculous hours just to keep their jobs, just to do the stuff that they love, and, be as loud as possible if those events occur, so that people know that, first of all, that they're supported. So it's great for the researchers that are there to feel that, but also to let government know that, the community cares about this and we all should care about it.
Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Cheers. All righty. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
No problem, mate. Anytime. Yeah, easy.